Significant investments continue to be made by government towards the development of a modern railway network. We believe in this because we know that creating an alternative means of transport, especially for goods, will ease the pressures on our roads and future impacts of global crude price hikes on farm products. For example, government is within target to complete the construction of the new Tema-Mpakadan rail line by the end of this year. The project is currently about 92% complete. The operationalization of the project is expected to enhance efficiency at the Tema port and provide the shortest possible transportation route between the southern and northern parts of Ghana. The Ministry of Roads and Highways is currently under review by Gov't, Ministry of Roads and Highways, the Office of the Attorney General, and the Ministry of Finance. When completed, the concession agreement is expected to be approved by the PPP Committee, Cabinet, and Parliament. The completed road will be tolled. Mr. Speaker, all new roads of this nature will be tolled.
Well, here we are discoursing on what exactly Finance Minister Ken Ofori-Atta told us yesterday in that statement, that speech, not necessarily a mid-year budget review, but there's a whole lot to dilate on. You heard part of it, the tolling of newly constructed roads, the Tema motorway extension will be tolled, among others, to come. We also have the dynamics when it comes to our GDP growth rate that has been slashed. We also have to talk about oil, non-oil GDP growth rates. We have the Fitch Solutions rating, among a pot of issues to discuss. Well, joining us for these discussions, Professor Lord Mensah. He is with the University of Ghana Business School. We also have political risk economist, Dr. Theo Acheampong, who joins the conversation. Dr. Acheampong, a very good morning to you. Thank you for joining.
Pleasure.
Great. Let me also confirm that we have Professor Lord Mensah. Prof, a very good morning to you.
Yeah, good morning. If you can hear me.
I can, loud and
good morning. Yeah. Okay, that's fine.
Right. All right. So just hold for me, Professor Mensah. I'll be coming to you shortly. But let me start with you, Dr. Theo Acheampong. Yesterday, first of all, I've hinted at the fact that I was a bit disappointed. It appears right now when our budgetary statements are to be presented, we can expect them to be presented 3-4 hours later than expected. And of course, what was slated in the order paper as a mid-year budget review turned out to be a statement. But your reflections on, what happened, what the finance minister said, from our GDP to staying within the confines of appropriation for 2022, to the slashing of GDP growth rates, to, of course, there was a bit of the blame game there, COVID-19,
yes.
Ukraine, Russia.
Yes.
What is your general reflection in a few minutes? This is just what you saw and heard.
Absolutely. So good morning once again, and good morning to Prof and the good people of Ghana. I think first it was an admission to an extent of the reality, right? So to an extent, the government recognizing that things are not going according to plan. And in the first few paragraphs of the statement, you can see some sort of attempt by the finance minister to make us aware of the things that are going on. But that's where sort of I deviate from what he said.
Right.
Because in an attempt to admit the reality, then it means we also need to have an understanding of what the root causes are. So basically, what led us to where we are now, where we're needing an IMF support or a bailout. And of course, he talks about the Russian invasion of Ukraine. He talks about COVID. But interestingly, the bigger debate about, our fiscal recklessness and the fact that we've been living more or less beyond our means and with the excessive borrowing, all of that compounding what is a very dire or difficult situation.
That was conveniently overlooked.
Well, to an extent, it wasn't really there. And because there are two fundamental causes for a crisis. You have the external shocks, such as Russia, Ukraine, and COVID. And then you also have internal or domestic factors, such as running inappropriate fiscal policies that then leads you to having major issues within the economy. But what I saw really was an attempt, if you look at the paragraph 14 of the statement, and the latter bit, it says that it is therefore disheartening when people want to pretend that these developments are purely domestic. I don't think anyone has, sought to create that impression.
Exactly.
I think it's that the mixture of both domestic and external factors, and we need to recognize that that is what has led us down this path.
But even in talking about the domestic, you remember the vice president at the Accra Business School made mention of the fact that even domestically, it is two-pronged, and it simply has to do with the previous administration. One, excess power and having to pay for that, and then the banking sector cleanup, of which we were told that now we're going to have to expend another $8 billion for.
I get that, but that's not fully the case, and you may ask yourself, for how long are we going to play the political game of blaming another administration, for some of the issues that we see ourselves? Because you look at the data, the last IMF program we exited in April of 2019.
Right.
Some of those metrics were looking okay, but just after we exited that program, we started debt binging all over again.
Going back to the same habits that led us to the IMF.
And even if you look at the statement that the IMF issued in March of 2019, when basically they said we're done well in some aspects of the program, but a number of the core structural benchmarks reforms that are needed, we missed many of them. The integration of GIFMIS, fixing the payroll system, addressing state-owned enterprises, and then the recourse to Eurobonds, for a lot of the financing needs that we need. All these major issues are still there. So I personally don't, buy wholly the argument that it's to do with the past administration. That is why we find ourselves, in this picture. Nevertheless, if you look at even the revenue numbers that the finance minister mentioned, and then the expenditure, we can unpack them. But for me, it was very obvious that we have a much, much bigger problem. So, look at the statement. The e-levy was not mentioned once in the statement that the finance minister made.
Not once. I know we'll be talking extensively about that later, but there was a whole lot that people were expecting.
Interestingly, only a few weeks ago, we were told that it's actually the e-levy or the IMF. So you would have expected at least an update within that statement of how much we have collected so far.
Were you disappointed that we didn't get that? Because guess what? You can't get it from the GRA. It must be the central bank through the finance minister. And I mean, he went mute on that point, especially on the back of some of the research we've seen from Imani Africa and what we've heard from the likes of
part of that research, for the Imani research, I was actually part of it.
Exactly, you spearheaded that.
And led that research. But I think it's important, especially from the revenue side. The government says that, yes, they're slashing down revenue now to about 96 billion, and expenditure to about 135 billion.
The minority has said that is not practical. Moving from 100.5 billion to 96 billion, that is going to be a tall order.
I think it's not going to be possible, and the deficit numbers, as has been presented yesterday, would not be met, just for two reasons. The first one being that as of half year, in the statement the finance minister read, we've actually already have done a 5.6 or 5.5% deficit.
Right.
And we're saying that by the end of this year, you're going to do 6.6%.
6.6.
So
that was our target.
1.6%. What that tells you is that you then have to do some serious cuts or serious adjustment in order for you to actually meet that 6.6%,
So just to look at those details, the GDP growth was projected at 5.8%. it came down to 3.7%. That is what was mentioned by Ofori-Atta. Non-oil GDP growth, 5.9%. Now we've whittled it down to 4.3%. Inflation, 8%. It's standing
Almost
where
80%.
29.8%.
Yes.
The fiscal deficit, 7.4%, the projection, but now 6.6% is where we are at. And then primary surplus, 0.1%, upwards 0.4%. And of course, the gross international reserves of about 3 months mentioned there.
Yeah, I mean, and even if when you look at the reserve figures, they've come down quite significantly. In the last year to date, we were almost 12 billion of gross reserves. Now you're talking 7 point something billion. If you look at the net numbers, where it's the gross reserves now, the net reserves now is almost 3.5 or 3 point something billion, around the crucial 3 months of import cover. So it tells you that.
But just to stay
problems.
just to stay briefly on that point, you remember we were given some details, by the chairman of the Finance Committee of Parliament, who made mention of the fact that what they had said, 9 billion to 3 billion, whittled down to 3 billion, was actually not the case. That it was 7.7+ billion dollars. I just wanted to avert your mind to that.
It's a matter of semantics. There's gross reserves, there's net reserves. Right. Whether you look at the gross or the net, the point is that the reserve numbers have dwindled. And
so the 7 point something is
we're burning through a lot of our reserves to support imports and to prop up the economy. And if you use the net numbers, which a lot of investors actually pay heed to, I work within the markets in London, and I know when we speak to investors, these are the things that they're keen on, especially on net reserves, because that's what you literally more or less have access to.
Exactly.
And if you look at the net numbers,
salary.
if you look at the net numbers, it's actually come down from about 7.9 billion or so to 3.5 billion, more than half the amount in a matter of a year. So I get it that sometimes they want to play the politics and the NPP NDC things, but importantly, we need to have a bigger national conversation of what we need to do to fix the mess that we find ourselves in that regard.
I don't know yet whether we have Professor Lord Mensah, but let's also look at this briefly before we get interactive with him. So we don't have the full statement in terms of what was presented yesterday by Ken Ofori-Atta. It's 55+ pages. We have about 26 pages.
Yes.
That would also give us better scope in terms of other line items and smaller tidbits to look at. But there's also the issue of printing money. Isaac Adongo, Dr. Kasialato Forson of the minority side went hard on that. Look, two key issues. When you look at the Central Bank Act, if you're going to print money, you can't print more than 5% of your previous year's revenue, first of all. And two, Parliament must definitely be in the know. And so they accuse the central bank's governor, Dr. Ernest Addison, of some illegality. And they even go on to say that with the way the finance minister is going, he is digging his own grave into prison in some time to come. But the sums of money involved, 22 billion Ghana cedis, 48 million cedis, and the whole bit about we are sticking to our appropriations.
Yes.
What is fact? What is fiction?
Well, I mean, fact is the fact that the central bank has been supporting the government. And I mean, central banks all over the world, right, as part of their monetary policy coordination, can lend to the government. So it's two things they do. They actually print money and give it to the government, or they go and borrow money in what we call open market operations, where they will sell T-bills and other government securities to be able to then onward lend to the government. And if you look at the Bank of Ghana Act, you're absolutely right. In the amended Act section, I think 30 or 16 rather, that the total loans, advances, purchases of treasury bills and securities shall not at any time exceed 5% of the total revenue of the previous fiscal year. And then further down, it also says that the award or the making of this 5% in any previous fiscal year shall, or the governor of the Bank of Ghana shall notify the minister, Parliament, of the attainment of the limit under subsection 2, and then it goes on and on. So the key test really is that if we assume this 22 billion is fact, and I haven't seen any contrary numbers to that effect, then
I mean, they point to the fact that within the statement presented by the minister himself, that basically is evinced in.
Yes, but did it then meet this, 5%
These requirements,
threshold?
right?
Right, and did they follow through the processes to be able to fully execute those amounts? What is very important also maybe to state here briefly is that Ghana currently has been locked out of accessing the international capital market for the most part of this year. So what that then means is that you have to borrow from somewhere. And if you look at the landscape, it's actually hard to going back to the domestic market, so selling T-bills and other securities, and to an extent, the central bank also printing some money to be able to forward or on lend to the government. What I don't know, and I cannot state for fact here, is whether that 22 billion is indeed all attributable to just the printing of money, or there are other things such as the T-bills and other components within that. We can unpack that a little bit further. But the key, or the other key point here, as I finish, is the fact that the printing of that money is part of what is driving that inflation as we see currently. So the deficit financing by the central bank is a core driver of inflation in the country. So it's not just a question of imported versus non-imported inflation, or Russia, Ukraine, and the domestic factors, but the central bank's responsibility in that regard is part of what is actually been driving the inflation we're seeing recently.
And speaking of inflation, when you look at the monetary policy rate that has been held at 19%, what does that show?
I think that was a good decision. I expected it to actually keep it, or the monetary policy to keep it at 19%. Just
you expected it to stay at 19%?
I expected it to stay at 19% because any further hikes would have actually choked off more liquidity from the system and even made the cost of borrowing much higher for businesses. And number two, because the previous rate hikes were that steep, you need to give yourself a bit of time to see if indeed they're actually working in bringing down the rate of inflation. So I think that was a good decision, and we must commend the central bank for staying that course.
What would be the impact of that? I mean, the reasoning behind it, what would be the impact of that? Because we've seen what inflation has done. We've seen what the policy rate, how it has affected lending and all of that. So what would be the real impact of maintaining the policy rate?
Anytime your policy rate goes up, of course, the commercial banks also make an adjustment in that regard. And ultimately, the cost of borrowing goes up for you and I if we want to take money. The principal reason why they hiked up the rates the previous two times by 4.5% is just because of the rising inflation. But as some of us expect, inflation should start moderating as we go into August and September, also because you have like the food season coming up. And in that regard, the move that they made currently to keep it at 19% is just to see if in the next few weeks, inflation starts coming down. And if we see inflation coming down, then of course, the bank will take further corrective action or measures to further sort of reduce the rate. Because ultimately, you want to get liquidity in the system. You want to get, borrowings going, and you want to be able to support the good people of Ghana to be able to, afford credit. Because if the economy doesn't grow, then you're going to see job losses and you're going to see more protests on the street ultimately.
Let me try to see whether I have Professor Lord Mensah available. Prof, a very good morning to you. Can you hear me?
Good morning to everyone, and good morning to my good friend at the studio.
Right, Dr. Theo Champong, of course. So for you, what would be your very simple, reflection on the happenings from yesterday and some of I know you've been listening to us, some of what we've been discussing from, the monetary policy end of things, the GDP revised figures, and basically the avoidance, so to speak, of certain core areas of our national, reflection. What would be your thinking on the delivery yesterday by Ken Ofori-Atta?
Well, I think if you look at the entire, budget, taking it from the expenditure cut and then revenue, cut, I see a government that does not have money, but then government wants to still spend. It's clearly the discretionary expenditures that we're looking at, government possibly cutting them. We did not see any massive cut in there. And then also I saw an indirect expenditure cut, i.e. with the PPP agreement to construct the Tema motorway. It's more or less an indirect, expenditure cut, because government is not going to absorb fully that road construction, but then try to find equity in the entire agreement by, sourcing funds from GIIF. So it gives the signal that, yes, indeed, government may still want to have 8 projects outlined in the 2022 budget to go on. If you look at Agenda 111, for instance, it gave the signal that 87 of them is still ongoing. I mean, government is still bent on, building 111 hospitals at a time that we are halfway through an expenditure, we have a problem with it. So I was a bit disappointed because, this budget that was read does not set the tone for the IMF expectations. Because engaging IMF, we know that they come in with some, possible programs by cutting expenditure and then also having revenue enhanced measures. If you look at the various revenue enhanced measures that the government put in place in this review, I don't see any serious thing that we've not, seen before. And then also being silent on, e-levy. We did not hear anything on e-levy at all. At this time, I was thinking maybe he should have been able to tell us how the e-levy is faring, and then in the end, possible projects that they may have started with to whet the appetite of Ghanaians, and then possibly you get a full buy-in of Ghanaians to come back to that e-levy, electronic transfer of funds. So effectively, I see it to be government that is still bent on spending, not setting the tone, to meet the IMF possible conditions that they may come with.
Prof, even when Ken says that they're going to stick to the appropriation for 2022, you still see the signal that they want to spend.
Oh yes, I see the signal that they want to spend, because all the projects they outlined in 2022, they still want to go on with them. And as a result of that, I don't see a government that is ready to reduce its expenditure.
Speaking of expenditure, let's look at, so there are so many angles to actually contemplate, but let's quickly look at the sustainability of our debt before I get on to other matters. You made mention of that and how it will affect, any program that we'll get from the IMF. As of the latest figures we have, we're looking at 393 billion Ghana cedis, the equivalent of 54.4 billion American dollars. And then you add that to what the minority gleans from the statement from yesterday, that we've printed money. We're looking at 22 billion plus 48 million, whether legal or not. And then you add to the fact that we have arrears of about 25 billion Ghana cedis that is owed to, that are owed to contractors, to WAEC, to other institutions. How is this going to shape up, especially in respect of the sustainability of our debt?
See, if you look at the debt sustainability issue, I have a serious problem with it in a sense that, the debt accumulations and all those, who produces the numbers for the minister? It's a technocrat we have at the ministry. They produce the numbers for the minister. So effectively, if we're not getting the numbers right, then probably somebody might not be doing his job at the ministry.
Are you suggesting? Are you suggesting, like the minority says, that maybe the numbers are being cooked?
Probably, because I get worried when we keep on tossing our economic numbers here and there. I mean, recently we had an issue of our international, reserves dropping to a level where, we called in for an approval of, 750 million. But then in the end, it turns up that that wasn't the drop that is expected. You see, when you provide that kind of uncertainty, it
appears we have a bit of a challenge with Professor Lord Mensah's connection. We'll try to get him back and have him make his point. We'll see whether technology will be nice to us today so we can actually have this conversation. Prof, can you hear me? Okay, so yes, Prof, I think the connection is better now. Please go ahead. Hello, Professor Mensah. All right, we'll work on that and try to get Professor Mensah back. So in terms of sustainability, Dr. Achampong, it's going to be quite a hurdle.
Of course. I mean, look, even before the current statement, the World Bank had already classified us as being at high risk of external debt distress.
Right.
And
we're seeing the chart from Bloomberg telling us that we're just second to El Salvador. So.
Well, I mean, so that has been an issue, and this has actually been an issue even before the pandemic, before Russia-Ukraine, right, in that regard. But Prof makes an interesting point, which I think is quite vital. How much trust can we put in the statistics that is being churned out by different government agencies, right? Especially given that in the past, even the IMF has had cause to question some of the numbers that have been provided by i.e. Finance Ministry and related agencies for that matter. Like Prof is saying, I also get worried a lot, and I deal with a lot of these investors as a day job. When they come to you and they're like basically asking you questions, can we trust the statistics that your government has actually put out there? Because that
those questions are posed. Can you trust? There's mistrust.
I get asked those questions pretty much every time, right?
Wow.
And then you have to more or less go back and say, I mean, these are the official numbers. Sometimes, yes, you make some corrections.
Official numbers that you cannot necessarily
make some
corroborate.
Changes. Well, I'm not in the nick of the action, so you cannot corroborate. But of course, you talk to them and give them the assurance that, these are the numbers as we know. And then you can cross-check with some other indicators, high-frequency data indicators, to see if they're in the right ballpark or not. But we shouldn't, at this stage of our development, have been having a debate about whether the reserves and the deficit and all those numbers are right or wrong. We should have gone way past at that point. But the big issue really here is that even at our 78% currently debt to GDP ratio, and the IMF is doing the debt sustainability analysis now as part of all of the assessment they need to do before lending to Ghana. I foresee us crossing beyond that 80% threshold by the
because
end
we're
of
at 78.3.
Well,
and already
we did 80, and then
yes.
we adjusted the denominator, the GDP,
exactly.
And
some are saying that if we add our other debts, other line items, it will definitely shoot over.
It is 80%. Going to, and then the issue also with particularly this administration has been this above the line, below the line reporting, where certain items don't make their way into the final debt numbers. So for sometimes they would exclude the financial sector bailout, energy sector cleanup as kind of exceptional items. But they're all part and parcel of the debt.
It's all part of the debt
and
stock.
the deficit numbers, right? Anyway,
are those things going to injure? Are they going to
80%.
injure our negotiations with the IMF?
I think the IMF is going to ask for honesty. The IMF is going to ask the government to come and open their books. It's going to be one of the key conditions for any onward lending. And that is what also, to an extent, gives me a bit of assurance, right? That we would know what may be the true state, to borrow other words, of the economy would be, because the government cannot, attempt to put certain numbers in places that they shouldn't be. And remember that the IMF, before the lending, would do what we call the Article 4 consultations, which eventually would actually lead to a report that they publish on their website on the state of the Ghanaian economy, or indeed any other economy for that matter. So I particularly am actually looking forward to that report. But I mean, we do have issues with some of the statistics that are being churned out. And I think it is not right that as a country we should be debating these numbers, because as a Ghanaian, I get worried when an investor calls me and asks me, is your government churning out the right numbers?
Let me engage Professor Lord Mensah before I come back to you, Dr. Theo Champong. Prof, you left off with some thoughts you were sharing. You can take off from there.
I was looking at the inconsistencies in our numbers, economic numbers. I mean, clearly, we really have to be careful with that, because you look at the three economic arms of, governance, that is Bank of Ghana, looking at the Ministry of Finance, and then possibly adding on the executive, I mean, if I put it that way. And you keep on getting different numbers from them when it comes, even Parliament is part of it, when it comes to, our economic indicators. It doesn't speak well of us. And this also smacked, on whether we really have a very good information flow across these institutions when it comes to our economic management. Economic management and its projections has to do with, having the data and taking decisions with the data. So if it turns up that you have a different data set at, different units within the country, you may not have come out with very good policies. And I'm not surprised that we keep on having inconsistencies in our, policies. Even the budget that was read, 2022 budget, it was made clear that if we accept the levy, we may not go to the IMF. But then it turns up that we went to the IMF. But then the levy, we went to the IMF because the levy was not giving us the numbers that is expected. I asked myself, who did that projection? A projection where, you could not even make up to 10% of what is expected from, the levy. So for me, I think we have problems when it comes to our economic management. The inconsistencies are too much.
Do you feel we will meet sustainability levels as far as the IMF is concerned? Dr. Theo Champong was just talking about the Article 4 engagements that will have to be held. Do you feel we will meet those? Because guess what? There are other countries like Sri Lanka that have been engaging the IMF, and we all have to go through the same process, meet sustainability levels before the IMF will accept and give us the sums of money required.
That is why I gave you the signal that the budget, the review, does not really set the tone to the level of sustainable, fiscal discipline that IMF is expected of us before they give us any facility that they want. So for me, I think from that end, if a government is still having that appetite of spending, a government is still, having a problem with raising revenue, for which revenue measures put in place in the review were not that clear. They are not new things that we've not seen before. Things like electronic VAT, introduction and all those. We've seen it and we've heard it before. So I'm wondering what difference are they going to make in our revenue, generation. So for me, I think we've not positioned ourselves clearly, to have an IMF program from this review.
I want to run two quick things by you. Doc, I see you have a lot on your mind. I'll be coming to you. I want to run two quick things by you, Prof. But the first has to do with spending and sticking within appropriations. So quoting the finance minister, he says, in spite of the underperforming revenues and strong external headwinds, we are not seeking additional funds in the mid-year review. We are determined to efficiently use the windfall from the upstream petroleum sector to make up for our revenue shortfall and aggressively improve our revenues even as we rationalize expenditure. So he's talking about the windfalls from the upstream petroleum sector. How sustainable is that? Right now, we know on the back of what has happened between Russia and Ukraine, yes, oil prices have seen some of the highest in recent decades. But how sustainable is that to bank on? And also put that side by side with the fact that the net in terms of our debt keeps widening, both internal and external. And guess what? In that same statement, the finance minister made mention of the fact that Ghana still needs some 8 billion Ghana cedis to fix the financial sector. Professor Mensah? It appears the connection has been lost once more. We'll try to get Professor Mensah back. Maybe let me come quickly to you on that.
Yeah, so let's unpack them. Let's start with the windfalls argument. So in the 2022 budget, the government expected that they would be getting about $1 billion coming through from oil and gas, upstream oil and gas exports from 3 fields that we currently produce. Actually, if you look at the production levels, they've gone down slightly. Mm-hmm. However, because the price has been high, that has more than
we're getting a lot more
for that. And in the half-year report that PIAC issued recently, and also Bank of Ghana issued, we've gotten a little over $700 million for the first half of this year coming through. If you do the projections, and this is an area that I work in, so I kind of know the numbers, we possibly could get between 1.5 and maybe $1.7 billion of oil monies coming in.
So that would be a windfall of about $500 to $700 million.
But to put it also in context, this would have been the first time in the history of Ghana that would have then crossed that 1 billion revenue mark. Right?
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, from 3 fields. Again, just a bit of history here. In 2009, 2010, when Jubilee was just about coming on production, the projections had been made that Jubilee alone at one point could get us up to $1.8 billion a year.
The Jubilee field alone?
Yes, that never happened because of cost issues and then because of the price. There will be some windfall this time around. If you assume you're going to even get $500, $700 million, question fundamentally is that windfall going to be enough to really fill the size of the gap or the hole that we have in terms of the deficit and the debt numbers?
And even considering that when it comes to even oil, our own internal needs, because this doesn't suffice to even take care of our own internal needs. We also have to import.
Of course. So, I mean, at the same time, last year we spent $2.7 billion importing petroleum products into the country because you have a refinery that hasn't been working and there's a whole monopoly within the system that then leads to a lot of inefficiencies in the downstream side of the industry. So yeah, you're getting 1.7 billion possibly this year. But at the same time, you're spending far more of that actually importing petroleum products into the country. So the net effect actually is one that is practically nothing to write home about in that regard. So your trade balance or your balance of payment, yes, we see some improvement, but ultimately we're still having to fork out more to be able to support petroleum products importation into the country. So you do have some windfall, but realistically it's actually not enough to be able to fix the gap. Then there are 3 other things that I think the minister also talked about. Rationalizing expenditures. That is where we need to do a lot of work on. And then there's things about property rates, and then the reinstatement of some of the road tolls. I have always supported road tolls one way or the other, especially on your key, economic routes, right?
Were you disappointed they took it off?
It never made sense to me.
Because it was raking in 200,000 CDs every day.
What we needed to do was to find efficient means of collecting those tolls, one. And then number two, make sure that they actually used to fix those very roads, right? Those key economic roads that you have. But luckily, they zero rated it. So technically, it was never scrapped. It was just you bring the rate down to zero. So now you can actually go back and reinstate some of those tolls on those key roads. Now they say they're going to do under PPP and some sort of arrangements like that. But secondly,
so that these
I also
are self-funding projects over time.
But I also think every car in this country must pay some form of road tax or the other. And this happens all over, the world. For example, in the UK where I'm based, anytime I go to renew my roadworthiness, we call it MOT in the UK. As part of that, you have to pay a vehicle tax, right? Based on the type of your vehicle, the emissions, and all of that. And I think we have the infrastructure now through DVLA to actually be able to collect some form of, road tax.
So that's the next step. That's something we
in addition to whatever we actually would collect via the tolls. But the tolls would only be on your key economic routes, your Accra, Kumasi, Tamale, or Elubo to Ho, those sort of places. Yes, Accra, Tema, those places you need definitely to toll them.
Some would also tell you that with all of these tolls, there could be levy or tax fatigue. So, like you're saying, it should be specific for certain major routes and not beyond those routes.
It cannot be on all routes. It has to be on the major routes.
Because there's also the issue of traffic on some stretches.
Yeah, so the issue of the traffic can actually be solved by using digital technologies, right? Where you could use your Momo and other smart cards and things like that to significantly reduce the traffic issue. I don't think the traffic issue should prevent or stop us from collecting those tools, because it can actually be solved one way or the other.
We'll try to, if possible, maybe get Professor Mensah on the phone so we can have a proper conversation, because it appears technology is hindering or hampering the flow. So maybe if we could get him on phone, that wouldn't be bad. But yesterday, your own colleague at the Andrews University in the United States, Professor Pepra, made mention of the fact that, look, we must also take a look at some of the social intervention programs. We've not paid LEAP beneficiaries for 6 months. NAPCO beneficiaries are also in some sort of limbo. Yeah. With all of these, then looking at free SHS, and some have said that free SHS is not the problem. The problem lies elsewhere. Free SHS is just taking a pittance of the money, but because we have cracks in the system, it's also reflecting on feeding and other components that feed into free SHS. But he suggested that maintain free SHS, like Bright Appear of Child Rights International has put forward, and scrap something like planting for food and jobs. It's not serving its purpose. What's your take?
Yeah, I think a number of the interventions, we need to holistically look at them, right? Which ones are working, which ones aren't working, how do we...
So you are for a review of the social intervention
across the board, no two ways about that. In fact, yesterday somebody told me, look, Theo, you're going on TV, let them know that we haven't been paid our NAPCO or something for 8 or so months, to that extent.
About 10 months.
Yeah, so there are real issues. And the fact is that we keep promising, we keep making these huge interventions with very little coming in terms of revenue to actually support them. And of course, we sometimes don't also then fully reflect on or review these programs to ensure that you have cost and efficiency savings as well. I think even on free SHS, the scope for efficiency savings, the scope to also allow those who are prepared to, put some money on the table to support their wards and their schools to do that. I personally have never believed in the state taking on that full responsibility for boarding and feeding, right? In that regard, and every little that we save can actually go in other areas. So even let's stick with the free SHS argument. The biggest needs that we have in our education system is actually down the education chain in your basic education, your GSS, your primary, your kindergartens, and then your JHS, right? We need to address those issues. And we know that we have revenue challenges. So surely, what I would have then expected is that if we make any savings on free SHS and allow, say, parents to contribute something towards the running of the boarding facilities and things like that, those savings can actually be channeled into building more schools.
Downstream, right.
That
the
is where the
stream.
biggest issues are.
Because we still have schools under trees and dilapidated structures and all that.
Within our educational setup in that regard. And then you have other programs, Planting for Food and Jobs. NAPCO is being retired, but you're going to have USTAT and all those things.
Right.
And if you look at some of the academic studies, in terms of the effect or the effectiveness of some of these interventions, it leaves a lot to be desired. So basically, we end up pouring money down the drain or into a leaking basket.
We have Professor Mensah on phone now. Prof, so you were making the point about windfalls from the upstream petroleum sector vis-a-vis the 8 billion Ghana cedis that we are also going to cough up again, still talking about fixing the financial sector or the banking sector.
Yes, of course. I mean, the upstream petroleum inflows that the minister talks about. For me, the net effect, because we import fuel as well. So if price of fuel is going up on the global market, even though what you export, can give you more, what you import, and I think over the years we'll be importing more than what we export. So the net effect is not something that we can talk about, because you still have to buy crude at that market price that we're looking at. And look at our budget deficit. The budget deficit that we're looking at, I mean, he sliced it down to around 36 point something billion. And if you're talking about windfall, how much are we going to rake in from these inflows for us to, fill in that budget deficit? For the government to say that I still want to go ahead spending on the free SHS, I still want to go ahead to spend on USTAT, I still want to go ahead to spend on Agenda 111. Effectively, these are all discretionary, expenditures. And as I indicated to you earlier, government is not prepared to cut down expenditures as, expected, to set the tone, to position itself so that we can get an IMF program as quick as possible. So from the outline, you realize that the government did not mention what do we call it, levy. And one thing that I'm happy, which I think is a direction that the country must go, is the privatization of the roads that we have in this country. You realize that in the budget, which for me is an indirect expenditure cut, he indicated in the review that, look, we're going to partner with a private man to have, the Tema motorway, but then government is going to realize its equity in there by sourcing funds from the GIIF to put in as, part of the government equity so that we can at least have control maybe on the pricing or something. But, when it comes to the private man, you cannot go and say that you may want to use levy to pay for that, road construction. No. The private man may want to see exactly the revenue that is coming from roads. levy has been earmarked for so many things. It has been earmarked for USTAT. It has been earmarked for roads. It has been earmarked. Part of the Agenda 111 is still in the levy. So effectively, engaging the private man, I believe that will call for the replacement to bring back the road tolls, as the minister indicated, and that should be the way to go. For me, it's about time we pick some major roads and give it to the private man. But whilst we're doing that, we provide the alternative that the government will still have control over. So it is the right direction to go, and effectively it is more or less an indirect expenditure cut because government is not absorbing that construction on its balance sheet. So yes, that is what I see on the budget.
Let's take a quick look at two matters. Social intervention programs. Which ones do you feel? How do you feel we should tackle them? tackle them? Should some of them go? And
Yeah,
then there's also...
I was surprised. It's too late now. I was surprised. It's too late now to say that some of them should go.
Because the finance minister said they were sticking to their guns. They wouldn't touch them.
You see, if you look at the budget, right, I was looking at, the budget reflecting on the recent, Ghana Statistical Service data that they brought about on inflation. If you look at the disaggregation on inflation, you realize that clearly the household essentials are the ones, causing inflation to go up. So you're talking about food that we must eat, you're talking about water, you're talking about transportation. Now, if you look at the food security measures that the minister, laid out in the, in the review, clearly it doesn't seem to be solving that problem that we have in our homes. And so, I'm not surprised that he said the end of the year inflation is going to be around 26 point something percent. It means that it's come to accept that inflation has come to stay. Inflation has come to stay. In the end, will propel interest rates to go up. Cost of borrowing is going to go up.
Exactly.
At the end of the day, fine, of course, pensioners who have their funds in investment are going to enjoy, but then they still have to buy at high price when it comes to. Because
So
if you look at the food
it's a
security,
win-lose situation. You win here, you lose on the other end.
That is how it has been always. That is how it has been always. But we are looking forward to economic restructuring, for which at the end of the day, the basics that we consume in our homes will be cheaper for us. So if you look at the food issues, the food measures that he put up here, he's talking about, if you permit me to read, place a temporary ban on grains, so maize, rice, and soya export.
Right.
Promote the use of organic fertilizer and cultivation of crops such as roots, which require less fertilizer. You see, we know very well that our dependence of Ukraine and Russia for our agriculture input policy was one source. And so, what did we do to ensure that the food that we grow will be staples that our weather can withstand it without necessarily importing much fertilizer? We didn't concentrate on that. So, for me, the food measures that he put in place, I'm emphasizing on the food measures because of the inflation disaggregation. If you go on the inflation disaggregation, you realize that food is costing more. Transportation is also costing more. Transportation, we can't do much about it until we fix our roads very well. And then, the other one with the other side, which we don't have control over, is the global, crude price. But then, if we fix our road very well, it should be able to have a way of, toning down transportation. So we will have controlled, inflation in our environment. So I would say that yes, it's a review. But then what we saw in the the November 2021 budget that was read for 2022, we don't see any much different in there. If you ask me.
Now, Fitch Solutions has downgraded us. Initially we had an IMF, grading of, our economy, hoping that would get a growth of 5.2%, the World Bank 5.0%, and Fitch Solutions giving us 4.8%. They've downgraded us to 2.6%. Add that to the fact that we still have to deal with a certain COLA, cost of living allowance for labor. What is going to be the impact of that, especially looking at our deliberations or negotiations with the IMF?
Yeah, of course, that is going to be more or less a part of an expenditure that the government hasn't got control over. When it comes to the balance sheet of a public entity like Ghana, you have interest payment. You don't have control over them. You must pay. You have, you have salaries and emolument. You must pay them, and the projections that come with it. So if you are budgeting in 2022 and you expect that inflation can go up to a certain point where, labor may demand, their fair share of increase in price, then of course you should budget that into your the expenditure projections when it comes to labor force. those ones are easy to project. So I will not say that, for the fact that workers are requesting for COLA, and then, there are some increment just to catch up with inflation, may derail that stream of expenditure. If you are budgeting, the most difficult part is the discretionary ones. The non-discretionary ones, like interest payment and salary, the possible increment. So the government cannot tell us or cannot tell Ghanaians that they least expected, that kind of demand from the labor market. So it is easy to project expenditure and salary, and I don't think government will have problems meeting those demands.
The last bit I'm going to run by the two of you before we escalate the conversation. It has to do with what was not said yesterday. And a lot of people said, okay, so a lot of what was said may be expected or nothing new. But what was not said? What was left out? The savings being made by government on the back of the 30% salary cuts for the executive, fuel cuts, among others. No details. Also no details on the e-levy, which we're going to go hard on shortly. In fact, there were also no proper details on COVID-19. We've heard from the chairperson of the COVID-19 Trust Fund, former Chief Justice Sophia Akufo, on the unavailability of details concerning COVID-19 spending. And quote, she says, "To be very honest, I was rather surprised at the Minister of Finance because our COVID-19 Trust Fund figures were available to the Finance Ministry." I'll take your points on that, Prof, and then I'll let go of you with your concluding comments. And I'll bring that same question to
you see, in Ghana, I've noticed something in Ghana, from the institutional level all the way to the national level.
And what is that?
We love parading liabilities. We love parading expenditures. We love parading, but there are some critical decisions that we take. There are some critical policies that we roll out that is able to generate, that is able to save cost. And cost savings is an indirect revenue generation. So I'm surprised for the minister not to report on some of the cuts they made, the 30% Article 71, compensations cut, and then also cut down on 50% of fuel, a free fuel for these workers here and there.
Cuts down on travel as well.
Exactly. It should have come out with a figure to tell us that having done that, we've been able to save this amount. And then again,
do you feel this was deliberate? For example, when it comes to the e-levy, because because we are not raking in what we expected.
That is why I mentioned earlier that we love parading liabilities, forgetting about the possible assets that we have or revenues that we are generating. If you take for instance the e-levy, we know e-levy has trust issues. E-levy has problems. Ghanaians are not buying into the e-levy. If you look at the mobile money volumes of transactions over the years, so how do you convince them? It's a matter of telling them this is what we've rigged in, and this is what we intend to do with the money. And by so doing, Ghanaians, if they realize that you are using the money for maybe a road, you are using the money to provide a toilet facility, or those uncompleted toilet facilities scattered around, the country. If you are using the money to finish all of them, Ghanaians will buy into it. Because at the end of the day, the projections we did for e-levy wasn't that spot on. And so, if you really want to convince Ghanaians to buy into it, it's a matter of, providing them more information on it and then telling them what you intend to use the money for. And in 6 months' time, they should see exactly what you are using the money for. So for me, I have a problem with the way we report most of our balance sheet. And it's not at the national level alone. It has to do with the institutional level as well.
Well, interesting thoughts there. Prof, we'll have to hang the conversation here. We're grateful that you took the time to join us, unless you have any parting words.
No, I'm fine. I think I was driving. I had to pull off and then, speak to the program.
Right. We're very grateful. Professor Lord Mensah is with the University of Ghana Business School. Let's come into the studio for your take on that before we get into a proper conversation tearing apart the e-levy.
The government said they're going to reduce the expenditure by about 20 to 30%, right? Across the board, and there were some specific line items. But if you're going to be making 20, 30% cut in expenditure, and you look at the revised numbers where your expenditure is coming down from 137.5 to 135.7, surely that's not anywhere close to that 20 to 30% cut that they had announced. So I think it was more rhetoric and less of the substance, right? In that regard,
More talk than walk.
But also it goes back to a lot of the points Prof was making too about the fiscal rigidities within the budget itself. That the interest payment servicing actually has gone up this year. And then you have the employee compensation and then the other subventions that you have to make to district assemblies, common fund, and those other. So then you have very little left in terms of fiscal space to be able to spend on other kind of priority areas. So I always, for me, thought that the 20 to 30% cut was going to be a bit problematic to actually meet, looking at those structural rigidities that we're talking about in that regard. And then secondly, on the issue of COVID-19 spending and all of that, a few of us have actually called, and I think the finance minister has also given the Auditor General the kind of get-go or his blessing to audit the COVID funds. And for me, why this is really important is that when you look at the Auditor General's reports over the years, you see consistent hemorrhaging of public finances, right? A lot of financial irregularities, from payroll fraud to things to do with tax irregularities and other things to do with how we award contracts, and all those things cumulatively add up to some of the inefficiencies that we see. I was quite happy to hear that finally the tax exemptions bill has actually been passed by Parliament. I think I heard it on the radio coming into the studio this morning. And I think that will go a long way to streamline things, because that's another area where we can make major savings in that regard. And then, the point about food security, which Prof talked about. I mean, we know that we need to eat and grow and eat what, we can as much locally. The problem has been that when you look at the agri-value chain and how we use, scientific information, sometimes it's a bit lacking. So I know that the CSIR, Council for Scientific and Industrial Research, they've done tremendous work over the years about developing, climate-resistant, maybe maize or sorghum or millet or whatever varieties.
Right.
They've done work on, how you can use organic farming to be able to get as much of the yields as you can by applying fertilizer. But ask you, where is all this work? It's lying somewhere, sometimes gathering dust and rotting away. So it tells you really fundamentally that the way we have developed our industrial ecosystem and the links between agriculture and value-added manufacturing, we need to do a lot more.
We need to look at that.